Hello and welcome to this week's episode of Did Shakespeare. My name is Cassidy Cash. Pal back there is visiting with us this week as well. When you look up clothing irons, the first electric one was made in 1882, and that seems to be a very popular event in history in general. But if you, as I did, get interested in what happened for William Shakespeare, and you get incensed by the obvious reference when you Google clothing irons, then you decide to dig deeper. And there's a surprising history to keeping one's clothes free from wrinkles. And it seems William Shakespeare would have had various tools for this purpose available to him for keeping his poofy shorts and his doublet all crisp and clean, which is why this week we are asking, did Shakespeare use a clothing iron? While there were smoothing tools available in China as far back as the 1st century BC, that relates more to global human history than what was going on in England for William Shakespeare. Because until the advent of international communication tools like the phone and later with the internet, there's a limited amount of influence between Asia and the happenings in England where Shakespeare lived. It occurs, but for the purpose of our conversation on the history of William Shakespeare specifically, we're confining our history to the UK and immediately surrounding neighbors. To that end, people in Northern Europe were using stones and glass and even wood for smoothing their clothes, and they did that since the Middle Ages. These methods of smoothing clothes would continue even into the 1800s, which was after blacksmiths started inventing what Western civilization thinks of as this flat smoothing iron that your grandparents or even great-grandparents might have had. And so the smoothing iron, or with stone, glass, and wood, not even being made from iron, the metal, were all ways that Shakespeare would have had the option of using to smooth his clothes. But what would have been the most likely object for Shakespeare to have used for smoothing his clothes? Well, here are a few contenders. Now, there were glass linen smoothers, which to me, if you've ever used a mortar and pestle, it kind of looks like you just took the pestle and added a big flat circle to the end of it and stamp. It's really what it looks like. And you could use that to smooth out your clothes. So that's one option. Shakespeare could have also used a slick stone. A slick stone were standard pieces of laundering equipment in the late Middle Ages in England and elsewhere, but they went on being used through to the 19th century, long after the introduction of metal irons for this purpose. They were convenient for small jobs, and if you didn't want to have to heat up a bunch of irons and lay out ironing boards and things like that, this one was good to use for that purpose. So slick stones continued to be a popular option for tailors and people who were in charge of laundering the household clothes. Sad irons is another option, and these were made from several different materials. These could have been made from iron, and blacksmiths started doing that, where you heat it in the fire or a stove and then iron out your clothes with it in England. But they were also sometimes made of stone, which sometimes you'll hear them called soapstone irons for that reason. The soapstone irons came over from Italy. There were also earthenware and terracotta, like you think of, ceramic type irons. These would typically come from the Middle East or France and the Netherlands. The flat irons were also called sad irons or smoothing irons, and they had metal handles that you could grip with a cloth or a thick pad to iron out. So this is the most analogous to what we think of as an iron today, where it has the flat edge and a handle, and you heat it up and then smooth out the wrinkles on your clothes. You would need at least 2 irons to work with a sad iron. One of them would be heating while you're using the other, and then you would trade out. Large households with servants had a special ironing stove or special ironing location for this purpose, and sometimes they would even have slots where you could put the irons in the stove and use them as you needed them. Obviously, if you're working with iron, you need it to not rust, and you need it to not stick to the clothes. If it's very hot, it's going to burn the clothes and stick to it. So they would often use beeswax to coat the iron, and so when they smoothed it, it was smooth. Now, this also meant that the clothes would end up covered in a thin layer of beeswax. You had to really be careful with the temperature when you were using sad irons, and experience would help you know when it was hot enough, but not so hot that it would burn the cloth when you used it. If you've ever talked to someone who has used these, and my grandmother did when she was ironing her clothes during my lifetime, she would have done this, and she would heat them up. And there is actually a scorch mark on one of our family heirlooms from where she got the iron too hot and set it down, and it scorched the table. So for Shakespeare's lifetime, this was an issue as well. You didn't want the iron to get too hot or it was going to burn something, but you needed to be hot enough that it got rid of the wrinkles. And it's fun to think about someone being an expert in this. And Charles Dickens actually has a reference to this process of experience when he writes in the book, The Old Curiosity Shop, about a woman who would hold the iron up to her cheek dangerously close to test whether the heat was correct for that purpose. Another option Shakespeare had available to him for cleaning and smoothing his clothes out was the ironing boxes. These ironing boxes were basically like the flat iron, except it had a box attached to it for charcoal. So it was a precursor to electric irons, really, because the purpose was to keep the iron close to the fire, and the box part would house a mini charcoal fire so that the iron was self-heating, and it had little chimneys on the top that would direct the smoke away from the clothes to keep the clothes from smelling like smoke, but to keep the iron hot as someone was working. Screw presses was another one. I like this one because it's a kind of a precursor to what we have here in the 20th century, or at least the early to mid 1900s, for US washing machines. If you've ever seen an antique washing machine where it has the we always called it a smusher. I think it has, I think it's actually called rollers or calendars, but where you run the clothes through it to wring them out, that presses the clothes. And during Shakespeare's lifetime, there were screw presses and other kinds of presses, and known as calendars or rollers, where they would flatten and smooth the linen out by running them through these rollers. There was lastly a mangle board and rolling pin. These were like paddles or bats. They were sometimes called battledores, battles, beetles, or other variations on the word beating. And in Yorkshire, a bittle and pen was used in the same way as a mangle board and roller. So sometimes it's called a bittle and pen, sometimes it's called a mangle board and roller. It was used to smooth clothes out and obviously to beat the clothes as well. So which did Shakespeare use? Well, my best guess is that he would have been most familiar with the sad iron. And I make that proposition because the sad iron was also called a tailor's goose. And we find a reference to both the English tailor and the tailor's goose right within Shakespeare's plays. The reference that I found comes from Macbeth, Act 2, Scene 3, when Porter says, "Faith, here's an English tailor, come hither for stealing out of a French hose. Come in, tailor, here you may roast your goose." Now, as always, Shakespeare is making a play on words there that fits into a much larger story, and you should definitely go see Shakespeare's Macbeth performed on stage to catch all of the glory there. But for our purposes today, a tailor's goose was a colloquial expression for the tool used to smooth out clothing. A goose or tailor's goose was another name for an iron, and it came from the gooseneck curve in the handle, and that's why we continue to have the phrase gooseneck shape today. In Scotland, they would use the term gussing irons, which is a dialect approach to the word goose. So instead of goosing the irons, they were gussing the irons. While Shakespeare talks about iron in several of his plays, almost all of Shakespeare's references to iron are military references, where he's talking about strength and fortitude, or he's talking actually about metal weapons or daggers. And so it doesn't seem that the term iron was usually applied to the act of smoothing out one's clothes. That seems to be a more modern invention. For Shakespeare, he would have called it gussing out the clothes or goosing out the clothes instead of ironing out. And interestingly, William Shakespeare himself probably did not iron out any of his clothes. At home in Stratford-upon-Avon, it would have been either his wife, Anne Hathaway, their servants at the home, or when he was in London, he probably took his clothes to a tailor whose job was to clean and press Shakespeare's clothes. Links to all of these resources can be found in the full show notes for today's episode, which is linked for you directly below this video. That's it for this week. I'm Cassidy Cash, and until next time, I hope you learned something new about the Bard. I'll see you next week. Bye-bye.